For a lot of people, medieval armor looks like the closest thing to invincibility. But on real European battlefields, armor was never a perfect answer. As protection improved, weapons evolved right along with it, and some were designed specifically to crush, pierce, hook, or simply work around steel. In medieval reality, the most dangerous weapons were not always the biggest ones, but the ones that made armor stop feeling like a guarantee. This is the story of the weapons that made armor feel useless. Number 1. The warhammer. In medieval reality, armor almost never stopped feeling useful because someone neatly chopped through the center of a breastplate. What made armor feel unreliable was a weapon that attacked it in a smarter way. The warhammer is one of the clearest examples. Once full plate became common, sword edges were no longer the easy answer against a well-equipped man-at-arms, so fighters leaned toward weapons that concentrated force into a tiny area. That is exactly what the warhammer did. One side delivered a compact, brutal shock to a helmet or limb. The other side, the beak or bec de combat, was there for a different job: drive into weak spots, catch between plates, or threaten lighter areas of protection. In other words, the hammer did not need to cut armor open like cloth. It only needed to hit hard enough, or precisely enough, to make the steel work against the man inside it. A dented helmet could stun. A damaged gauntlet could ruin the grip. A strike into the elbow, knee, or visor line could change the whole fight in a second. That is why the weapon became so important in the 15th and 16th centuries. Museums that study original examples describe it as a serious knightly anti-armor weapon, and they make the point clearly. Once plate armor was dominant, the warhammer rose because it answered plate directly. It was useful enough that mounted officers carried it, and long-shafted versions even became popular with Swiss infantry. The shape of the head tells the whole story. This was not a battlefield ornament. It was a tool built for a world where armor was excellent, but never complete. And once fighters realized concentrated impact worked, the next step was obvious. Give that same logic a broader, heavier striking surface, and you get the mace. Number 2. The mace. If the warhammer focused force into a narrow point, the mace did something slightly different. It spread heavy impact through a compact head and turned armor into a partial solution instead of a full one. This mattered even before the best plate harnesses appeared, because mail was strong against cuts, but much less comforting against crushing blows. A sword could slide, glance, or fail to bite. A mace did not care about edge alignment, sharpness, or slicing technique. It only cared about landing. That made it practical in crowded fighting, especially on horseback or in a close infantry crush where there was not much room for wide swings. As armor changed, the mace changed with it. Royal Armories notes that once plate developed, mace heads gained flanges and smaller projecting points that helped them smash and buckle armor more effectively. So the mace evolved in direct conversation with armor, which is exactly what matters for this topic. It was not old-fashioned. It adapted. And it stayed relevant because it attacked the body through the armor rather than pretending the armor was not there. Even when the plate held, the blow could still rattle the brain, damage fingers, break rhythm, or drop a man to the ground. That is a big deal in medieval combat, because once an armored man falls or loses control of his weapon, the rest of his protection becomes much easier to exploit. The mace also had status value, and some examples were richly decorated, but its battlefield reputation came from something much simpler: reliability. It was short, tough, and direct. Against mail, it hit through the logic of the defense. Against plate, it aimed to deform, shock, and overwhelm. That is why armor could still be good and still feel frighteningly uncertain when a mace was in play. And if a mace was the straightforward anti-armor answer, the poleaxe was the more complete one, because it combined several answers in a single weapon. Number 3. The poleaxe. The poleaxe is probably the most complete anti-armor weapon in late medieval Europe. Not the most famous in modern movies, maybe, but in real armored combat, it is hard to beat. Royal Armories describes it very plainly. This was a two-handed infantry weapon designed to hack, crush, and pierce armor plates. That description matters because it shows how deliberate the design was. A poleaxe was not just a big axe. It usually brought 3 serious tools into one head: an axe blade for cuts, a hammer face for crushing blows, and a top spike for thrusting. Some versions also used the lower end of the shaft offensively, which meant both ends could matter in a fight. So instead of committing to one way of beating armor, the poleaxe gave the fighter options. If a clean cut was not there, he could crash a blow into the helmet or hands. If the target stayed covered, he could drive the top spike toward a gap. If distance changed, the shaft still let him manage space and control the exchange. That is exactly why this weapon shows up again and again in discussions of armored foot combat. It was built for the reality that the best armor was hard to penetrate directly, but never impossible to work around. The poleaxe could threaten the face, the joints, the weapon arm, the collar area, or the legs, and it could do that while keeping the opponent under pressure. It also fit the social side of late medieval war. Aristocrats and officers used it in battle and in formal combat, which tells you people who expected to fight well-armored opponents took it seriously. In simple terms, the poleaxe made armor feel smaller. It shrank the value of the harness by attacking from too many angles at once. And once that idea moved from single combat into larger infantry fighting, another staff weapon started making the same point on a wider battlefield. That weapon was the halberd. Number 4. The halberd. The halberd mattered because it showed that infantry did not need to break armor head-on to make armored men vulnerable. They only had to control distance, disrupt balance, and hit before the rider or man-at-arms could dominate the exchange. The halberd did all of that. It combined an axe blade, a top spike, and a rear projection on a long shaft, giving foot soldiers reach and several ways to attack at once. Royal Armories notes that it could keep mounted men-at-arms at bay, hook them, and unhorse them, while the Swiss used halberds effectively in battles like Morgarten in 1315 and Sempach in 1386. At Sempach, later examination of the dead even found skulls split by halberd blows, which gives you a very direct sense of how much force this weapon could deliver when it landed well. That is the important point. The halberd was not mainly about chopping through the center of perfect plate. It was about making the armor less decisive. A mounted fighter who is dragged offline, pulled from the saddle, or forced into a bad angle suddenly loses many of the advantages his equipment gave him. The same is true on foot. A polearm that can strike, thrust, and manipulate position is dangerous even when it does not land a textbook armor-piercing hit. And in real combat, that is usually how the problem was solved. Armor protected broad surfaces very well, but it could not protect a man from losing footing, from having his head snapped sideways, or from being finished once he was down. That is why the halberd stayed relevant for centuries. It rewarded discipline, formation work, and timing, and those are exactly the things that late medieval infantry got better and better at. In other words, the halberd did not make armor literally useless. It made armor less dominant. It reminded Europe that a man in steel could still be managed, controlled, and destroyed by trained foot soldiers. And if the halberd was the flexible infantry answer, The pike was the answer that made heavily armored cavalry think twice before charging at all. Number 5. The pike. The pike looks simple, but on a late medieval battlefield, it could make expensive armor feel strangely irrelevant. That is because the pike attacked the whole idea of shock cavalry, not just the metal on the rider's body. Royal Armories points out that men-at-arms would have found it nearly impossible to attack a wall of pikes, and even quotes a 15th century source claiming there was no armor so good that pikemen could not pierce or break it. Now, that should not be read as if every pike thrust magically punched through the best breastplate every time. The real effect was broader and more important. A dense formation with 4 or 5 rows of pikes turned approach itself into a problem. The horse had to face a forest of points. The rider had to stay balanced, keep formation, and somehow force his way through without being stopped, turned, or thrown into disorder. Armor helped with survival, but it did not solve the tactical problem in front of him. That is why pikes matter in this story. They changed what armored elites could do. The fully equipped knight, or man-at-arms, was still dangerous, but he was no longer guaranteed to smash disciplined infantry by weight and courage alone. Swiss and Flemish pikemen proved that over and over, and their success made pike formations attractive to cities, mercenary companies, and princes who wanted a cheaper answer to noble cavalry. In that sense, the pike did something very important to the medieval balance of power. It shifted confidence away from individual armor and toward collective drill. Once trained foot soldiers could hold a line of points and move aggressively in formation, armor stopped being the final word. It became one part of a much larger contest between discipline, reach, and timing. And that is a very medieval reality people often miss. Sometimes armor did not fail because the steel was bad. It failed because the enemy refused to let the armored man fight on his own terms. Still, once the distance closed and the fight became personal again, narrower weapons took over. One of the best at that job was the estoc. Number 6. The estoc. If you want a sword built around the armor problem instead of around fantasy, the estoc is the cleanest example. The very nickname says it all. The Met describes it as a thrusting sword, also called a Panzerstecher, literally an armor piercer. Its blade was long, narrow, very stiff, and usually shaped in a way that favored thrusting rather than broad cutting. That design choice matters because it shows how swordsmiths responded when mail and plate became harder to beat with ordinary edgework. Instead of pretending a slash would solve everything, the estoc went after the weak points. It was meant to puncture mail or reach into the gaps of plate armor where movement, breathing, and articulation still had to exist. In practice, that meant the estoc was not a dramatic chopping weapon. It was a disciplined, technical one. It punished openings. It rewarded precision. It worked with the understanding that armor did not need to be shattered everywhere. It only needed to be defeated once, in the right place. That made the estoc especially useful in the period when plate armor was at its height, and especially attractive to mounted men who wanted a sword that still made sense against armored opponents. A rigid point can do what an edge often cannot. It can slide into a visor opening, an armpit gap, the inside of the elbow, the groin, or the spaces around the neck and shoulders. It also works from angles where a broader sword cut might just skid away. That is why this weapon belongs on any serious anti-armor list. It reflects the real logic of armored combat, better than the usual cinematic sword swing. The estoc does not scream. It solves a problem. And once that thrusting logic influenced other swords too, even more familiar blades started being used in ways that modern audiences rarely expect. That brings us to the longsword, which against armor was much more technical than theatrical. Number 7. The longsword. The longsword did not stop mattering when plate armor improved. What changed was the way it had to be used. The Met notes that as plate began replacing mail and became more sophisticated, swordsmiths created blades capable of piercing gaps in armor's plates and even splitting mail rings. Surviving weapons from the early 15th century show exactly that trend. Acute points, rigid diamond or flattened diamond sections, and blades designed to thrust with authority instead of relying only on cuts. So the real medieval longsword against armor was not about wildly battering the middle of a cuirass. It was about control, angle, and precision. Fighters could use the sword with two hands, keep pressure at measure, and then shift into tighter work the second an opening appeared. That is why armored sword fighting in manuals looks nothing like modern fantasy choreography. The point was not to prove the sword stronger than plate. The point was to use the sword intelligently against the parts of the harness that had to remain open or flexible. Visors, armpits, mail voiders, elbows, and the spaces at the neck all mattered. Just as important, the longsword could flow into wrestling distance. It could threaten with the point, control the opposing weapon, and keep the enemy busy until the fight turned into grappling. In that sense, the longsword was a bridge weapon. It could work at range, in the bind, and in the clinch, which made it extremely useful even in an age of excellent armor. That also explains why later medieval swords often look narrower and more purposeful than earlier cutting weapons. They were being asked to do a different job. Against armor, the sword became less about dramatic blade-on-plate impact and more about steering a hard point into a place the harness could not fully protect. But once the fight collapsed completely and one man ended up on the ground, the weapon most likely to finish the job was not the sword. It was something smaller, stiffer, and meant for the final, ugly part of armored combat. That is where the rondel dagger comes in. Number 8. The rondel dagger. The rondel dagger is one of the best reminders that anti-armor combat was often about very small targets. Royal Armories describes it as a widely used knightly sidearm from the 14th to the 16th centuries, with a long, stiff blade and a thickened point that made it easier to pierce armor or find the gaps between plates, especially at the eyes, armpits, and groin. That is exactly why it mattered. A full harness could protect the wide, exposed surfaces of the body extremely well, but it could never seal the human body like a machine casing. The wearer still had to move, breathe, turn his head, bend his arms, and see. The rondel dagger existed for that reality. It was not there to replace the main weapon in open fighting. It was there to exploit the moment after balance broke down. Once a man was stunned, pinned, thrown, or trapped underneath another fighter, the rondel dagger became one of the most practical tools on the battlefield. It could be drawn fast, used in cramped space, and driven into the few surviving weak points that armor could not eliminate. That is why so many people underestimate it. They judge it by size when they should judge it by role. In close armored fighting, size was often the advantage.
A long polearm wins space. A dagger wins the last 6 inches.
And in medieval reality, those last 6 inches could matter more than everything that came before. The bigger weapons created the opening. The dagger finished the argument. That is also why armor could feel so psychologically fragile. Even if the plates held through the whole fight, one stumble, one pinned arm, or one bad landing could reduce all that expensive metal to a handful of reachable gaps. The ranged answer to armor worked on the same principle of pressure, but it arrived before the melee even started. That answer was the crossbow. Number 9. The crossbow.
The crossbow belongs on this list because it forced armor to evolve and kept pressure on armored men before they ever came to hand strokes. The Met notes that by the 14th century, the improved crossbow could pierce shields and mail armor, while Britannica points out that European crossbows were progressively developed to penetrate armor of increasing thicknesses. That is the real arms race in one sentence. As protection improved, the crossbow was strengthened to answer it. By the late medieval period, the most powerful military crossbows were no longer simple hand-drawn tools. They used composite or steel bows and mechanical spanning devices such as windlasses and cranakins, because human arms alone were not enough to cock the strongest versions. That meant more stored energy, heavier bolts, and much more serious anti-armor potential. Just as important, the crossbow changed who could threaten armored elites. A longbow demanded years of physical conditioning and practice. A crossbow still required skill, but it moved much more of the power into the weapon itself. That made it useful for militias, mercenaries, and garrison troops who could be trained more quickly. Now, this needs the right historical balance. A crossbow was not a magic key that made the best late plate worthless from every angle.
Good armor still mattered a lot, especially at longer range or on a bad hit. But battlefields were full of lesser armor, exposed faces, horses, and moments when a man had to move or turn. That is where the crossbow stayed terrifying. It punished anyone below the top tier of protection. It made mounted elites less comfortable at range, and it helped push Europe from mail toward plates, and then toward heavier plate. In other words, it did not just threaten armor, it changed armor. And because the strongest versions were slow to reload, defenders and professional soldiers adapted around that too, using cover, shields, and formation discipline to keep the weapon alive in prolonged fighting. Then gunpowder took the same basic pressure and pushed it even further. Number 10. The handgun. The handgun did not arrive as a perfect weapon, but it announced the future more clearly than anything else here. Royal Armories notes that early handguns were difficult to use and aim, yet could still cause significant damage, and experiments cited by the museum show that even simple guns could penetrate about 5 millimeters of steel sheet at short range. That is enough to explain why armorers and soldiers had to start worrying. This was no longer just a contest between better blades, stronger shafts, and thicker plates. It was now a contest against explosive force. Guns appear in Western Europe by the early 14th century, and by the mid-15th century, infantry with simple handguns were becoming increasingly common. Some early battlefield uses may even have been as much psychological as physical, with smoke, blast, and noise adding to the effect. But that did not make the danger less real. A horse hit by a handgun could go down. A rider hit in a thinner section of armor could be finished quickly. Even a near miss had a different emotional effect from an arrow or bolt, because gunpowder suggested that future improvements were going to favor the projectile more and more.
Britannica makes the longer trend brutally clear. Within about a century of plate armor reaching its artistic high point, the crossbow bolt, and especially the harquebus ball, helped make full plate obsolete. That does not mean one early handgun instantly erased armor from the battlefield. Medieval firearms were slow, smoky, inconsistent, and awkward. They were also the start of a new weight problem. To remain safe, armor had to become thicker, heavier, and more expensive, while the man inside it still had to march, breathe, climb, and fight. That pressure did not remove armor overnight, but it pushed Europe into a new era, where protection could no longer keep pace in the old medieval way. Late medieval soldiers were now living in a world where every improvement in protection invited a harsher answer, and gunpowder was the harshest answer of all.